Hey folks, if you enjoy the show and you want to help us make more videos, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Okay, thanks, bye, love you. Okay, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't so absorbed by Drive's style that I basically overlooked a lot of what was going on underneath the hood.
You're welcome.
I will withhold as many puns as I can, but I make no promises. But I think that the real lasting impact the film had on me, much like a lot of people, was the emphasis on two distinct relationships. The obvious being Ryan Gosling's Driver and Carey Mulligan's Irene, and the other being Ron Perlman's Nino and Albert Brooks' Bernie. You'll notice that there's a recurring duality throughout the film. Shannon and Standard are in debt, Nino and Bernie are professionally undermined, and Driver and Irene are confined to personal solitude. Then when you take Driver's character arc throughout the film, you start to see two independent conflicts, one about love, and another about hate. And because of this, I always like to think of Drive as simplistically about impulse, in the sense that the film is driven by sudden urges of emotional outbursts that are represented as violence. Hell, you could go as far as to define Drive as an umbrella term that encompasses the character's motivations to keep going in life when they've all seemingly hit a roadblock that leaves them stuck in a position they don't want to be in. In premise, it's a B-movie pulp-like crime drama, but ultimately that says less about the film considering how much it predominantly focuses on the relationship between Driver and Irene in the first half of the film, while the latter half reflects on how drastically sudden life can change. There is a very stilted nature to the film that requires patience to engage with its drama. It helps to accentuate this strange fragility around everything, especially in the performances, as you're just waiting for something or someone to crack. Since all the characters suffer from their own individual stresses, when the film switches to a much louder dynamic pace, it represents that unleash of withheld anger that manifests throughout the film. The characters all seem to withhold honesty about themselves, resulting in restrained emotional behavior as they try to maintain a strong composure despite their discontent. Because the more emotional a character becomes, the more it's reflected in how chaotic their life gets. Driver only ends up in conflict with the mob because he becomes emotionally invested in helping Standard pay his debt so that he can protect Irene, and Nino creates a conflict because he's consumed by his petty sensibility towards not being taken seriously by the mob. Hence my usage of the word impulse. Intellect allows you to make clear decisions while emotion restricts your ability to rationally control yourself. We see this vividly in Bernie and Nino's partnership. They have distinct personalities and beliefs. Nino is characterized with macho bravado, and Bernie is the opposite, being calm and collective. Well, to an extent. Essentially, Nino talks big, but Bernie walks big, and because of this, neither seem to reason with each other, thus justifying why they aren't taking all that seriously in the mobster world. They seem more like a thuggish gang than sophisticated organized criminals, and Bernie, despite his impressionable appearance, can't mask the fact that his own inner rage totally consumes him. In fact, Albert Brooks perfectly summarized his interpretation of the character. His reaction to killing someone is more of the "look what you made me do" type than because it's just business. Unlike Nino, he tries to maintain professionalism, but like Nino, human weakness always prevails. And Driver is just as equally guilty of this. Prior to the major conflict of the film, there is always a lingering air of distrust in Driver because we genuinely know nothing about him, and there's not much to imply either. Until the midway point, he's conveyed as emotionally detached from his criminal career and seeks to absolutely ensure his double life remains completely separate, and when his modesty clashes with his intimidating behavior, it casts a more sinister shadow over him. But then there's a point in the film where that duality in his behavior becomes one. This elevator scene basically encapsulates everything you need to know about Driver's world. In the book, yeah, there's a book, you actually come to know a lot about Driver's personal life, such as his family, friends, and his ex-wife. Yeah, he lives with his ex-wife, and his involvement was purely to make enough money so that he can move out of her apartment. In non-chronological flashbacks, it starts to remove layers of Driver's mystery that gradually form a picture as to who he truly is and why he came to be. Simply put, the book Driver rejects emotional attachment and relationships because everyone he knows ends up dead, including Irene, who for the record is named and described much differently in the book. The decision to extract this information from the film is like what Kubrick did with The Shining. It completely changes your perception of the story and characters without contradicting or diminishing the integrity of the source material. In the film, knowing nothing about Driver sells the skill and believability of his transition from timid young man to psychotic killer because there's no psychological conflict to contradict it. When he becomes a force to be reckoned with, it subverts everything we've perceived of him thus far. Nicholas Winding Refn interpreted Driver as someone from a Brothers Grimm fairy tale, which is perpetuated stylistically. While moonlighting as a getaway driver, the world is presented as cold and gritty, but when he's with Irene, the world becomes richer, vibrant, and peaceful, almost like a dream. In the elevator as he kisses Irene, the mood physically changes to reflect the perspective of Driver. The lighting focuses on their intimacy as if time stands still, allowing them to enjoy this final moment before Driver shatters the illusion and unleashes his built-up frustration that he'll never truly be happy without Irene. This one precise action categorically shows his emotions taking control of him that calls back to Nino and Bernie. That cold, calculated demeanor can never be more powerful than his love for Irene. Irene gives him purpose, a reason to keep driving forward, and by the end, when he does, it isn't for him, it's for her, perpetuating his true, undying love for her to the point that he has no choice but to bittersweetly separate himself from her. This disturbing act of violence is entirely romanticized. He's doing it out of love than simply survival. We know nothing about Driver's background, but we do come to understand him emotionally, which is ultimately enough to create a picture as to who he is as a person. At least I thought that until the film throws a spanner in the works with Driver wearing a mask to kill Nino. It implies a detachment from reality, but Hotline Miami, a game directly inspired by Drive, actually makes a point about the symbolism. To know oneself is to know one's actions. It calls back to his time with Irene's son, who is vastly interested in heroes.
Scary.
It isn't so much to hide his identity, but more so to mask or disassociate him from the responsibility of his actions. At the same time, it becomes a twisted superhero story that Refn also describes. He's placing his actions in the shoes of a character he invented, much like his persona as the Driver. At this point in the film, he's become an entirely different person. Gosling actually interpreted his character as a guy who's seen too many movies, and he's started to confuse his life for a film. He's lost in the mythology of Hollywood, and he's become an amalgamation of all the characters he admires. I actually have to agree with this. The scene feels like a reenactment of another film, and really, it reminds the viewer that the story feels like two different worlds crashed into one. The puns are still coming, I know. If you wanted to describe the film tonally, there is a wheel that keeps spinning the film between light and dark. Whereas Nino and Bernie represent traditional downplayed dialogue-driven mobster tales that make for the least visually interesting scenes, Driver and Irene are carried by Refn's ever-evocative show-don't-tell approach, where the camera lingers passionately on the characters with the dreamlike quality indicative of Driver's psyche. This can be as simple as the warmth and calmness of their drive, their extended eye contact, the blocking of the characters that shows the distance in their lives, or how they pass each other in the opening, where one comes home and the other goes to work, justifying their lack of interaction, thus making their first encounter all the more real and spontaneous. As you can tell, I really love this romance. They exist in a bubble of reflection and sentiment that wordlessly speaks of how much they need each other in times of loneliness. But we still need that conflict to break us out of the fantasy and back into the film's very real, gritty, and unpleasant world that so many characters want to escape from. What Drive becomes is a game of composure. It's a prolonged staring contest that requires restraint and self-discipline, and when you get to the end, the outcome is completely fueled by emotion rather than simply reason. The table meeting Driver and Bernie have is just a smokescreen to maintain the appearance of two mature professional adults who both have the same intention of cheaply stabbing each other. It makes the ending even more poetic, as the odds weren't stacked in anyone's favour. Honestly, I could have easily believed either of them could have walked away from this, but giving Driver the success neatly brings his story full circle. He's resolved a conflict and can now drive into a fresh start, with his presence remaining as a heroic legend for Irene and her son to remember as that one symbol of hope that was brought momentarily into their lives.